So what I'm going to do today is tell you about a study that my wife, Lara, and I led for over 25 years, a project that looked at the elephants in Tarangire National Park. And I'll talk about some of the research that came out of that, and also just talk about elephants in general. And I'm sure everyone over here loves elephants, and just explain why they're such fascinating animals. And I will then finish it off by giving a bit of a summary of what has been happening with elephants and the ivory trade in the past 20 years or so. So just so that everyone knows what we're talking about, let me just get my laser pointer. We're talking about Tanzania in East Africa, and Tarangire National Park is up in the north. It's on the northern tour circuit next to Ngorongoro, and it's a Serengeti National Park. And it's your classic savanna ecosystem. It has, sorry, let me just get rid of the pointer again. Yeah, so acacia tortoise, baobabs, and it also has pretty much all of the wildlife that you'd expect to see in your classic African savannas, everything except black rhino, which went extinct in the 1980s. But the park is best known for its elephant population. There are about 4,200 elephants using the park. And it really is one of the best places, certainly in East Africa, to see large herds of relaxed elephants. Now, I started up my PhD in 1993, and the first thing that you notice when you go out and start studying elephants is that, well, they're really rather large, and they certainly have capacity to inflict damage upon a vehicle. So I remember when I first started out, I'd gone out, I had my research camp set up, I had my little red vehicle that all the money in the world was invested in, and my notebook, my pen and pencil, and I went out and found a group of elephants, and this female looked at me, lifted up her head, and came barreling towards the car. So I put the car in reverse and got out of there, and then a little bit shaken, I went and I found another group, and the same thing happened. And again and again and again. And after 2 weeks, I was a little shell-shocked, and because I had basically convinced my committee at Princeton that I'd have no problems at all studying these animals. They'd all be very tame. And here I was being chased high and low over the savannah. So I went to talk to someone who professed to know a lot about elephants. He was a famous sculptor called Rob Glenn, famous East African sculptor. And he said, Charles, listen, if an elephant charges you, and it is screaming and trumpeting and making lots of noise, ignore it, because that's probably a bluff. What you really have to look out for is if it comes towards you with the ears flat back, trunk rolled up, and doesn't deviate for anything. So I thought, okay, well, I better go and try it, or go back to Princeton and study crickets or something. So I went out and I found a group of elephants, which I knew didn't like me. And sure enough, this female, she takes one look at me and she comes hammering down towards the car. And just in case, I hid underneath the steering wheel of the car, and 5 meters away she stops, and dust all over the place. And I said, right, that's how you do it. And then she charged again. And this time she came right up to the roof of the car and put her tusks right over the roof. And at this point, I'm really cursing Rob Glenn. But then the dust settled, and she looked down and I look up, and you know how when you look at an animal and you know they're not going to hurt you? And sure enough, she turns around, she let out a trombonic fart, and she walked off. And what I realized was that if you turn away from an elephant, you are being subordinate to it. If you run away from it, you are being highly subordinate. So at that point, I was about as low on the totem pole as you could possibly get. So it took me quite a while to work my way back up. I didn't back down. And after a while, the elephant simply gave up on me because I was no fun charging anymore. There were one or two mishaps along the way. This one was a little unfortunate for two reasons. First of all, it was a brand new car. And secondly, it was the very first day out in the field of a Tanzanian master's student of mine. And a female basically was having a bad day and pushed the vehicle about 40 meters. And anyway, after that, we drove back into camp. And then I was working in my tent, and one staff came along and said, Charles, you got to come and help. The student is sitting in the car in his towel and refusing to come out. And what had happened was that the poor guy had gone to take a shower, and had a bucket shower. And we'd forgotten to tell him that next to the shower, there was a bird bath. And every day, a female lioness was coming in and drinking from the bird bath. So he stepped out of the shower, saw the lioness and went, ah! And the lioness went, ah! And they both ran in opposite directions. And there he was in the car. And I thought, oh my goodness, I've lost him on the very first day. But anyway, he all credit to him, he stuck it out, but he's now switched the medical field. So we identify the elephants by their ear patterns, so the notches, their rips and tears on their ears. And they also have venation patterns, which are like human fingerprints. And every elephant, they have their own personalities, just like human pets do. And this one's called Fujo. It means trouble in Swahili. And he would always come and play with the radio antenna on the car. Now, I'm sure most of you know that elephants live in a matriarchal society. So at the very basis is a mother, her offspring and their young, or sometimes two sisters and their offspring. And group sizes can vary anywhere from two to over 60 animals. And you have these expanding levels of social hierarchy. So at the very basis is your mother-infant unit and a family group. And then when family groups get too big, they split into what we call bond groups. And then several bond groups that share the same dry season range, we call a clan. And then several clans will form a subpopulation, which share the same wet season range. And several subpopulations will form the population as a whole. And genetics analysis has found similar sorts of hierarchies among pretty much all savanna elephant populations. So those are the females. Well, what about the males? Well, what happens with the males is that they tend to leave the family group at a young age. In Tarangire, for some reason, it's very young. It tends to be about 8 or 9 years. In other populations, it may be 12, 13, 14. And what happens is that the males go off and they form, or they join these highly mobile and dynamic bull groups. And they spend a lot of their time basically just pushing each other around and mock fighting. And this is important because they need to know who is strongest, because when elephants reach a certain age, normally about 18 or so, they come into what's known as must. And must is an Urdu term, it means intoxicated. And the elephants get a big spike of testosterone, and they start streaming from the temporal glands, often dribbling urine. And it's a statement of intent, saying, I'm big, I'm strong, don't mess with me, or I'll beat you up. And it's equivalent to the deer rut. And I remember once seeing a young male when he was 18 years old, first time in must, and he was standing beside the side of the road, just shaking with anger. And he walked up to a bush and he sort of ripped the bush apart. And then he walked up to a tree and he knocked the tree down. And then he walked over to some females and he beat up the females. And then he ran into a big male, and the big male beat the stuffing out of him and chased him for several hundred meters, right? And the young male dropped out of must just like that. So basically, it's effectively a non-cheatable system. And there was an interesting paper that came out of South Africa a number of years ago. It was published in Science, and it shows what happens when you mess around with a complicated system like this. And what was happening was that the elephants were being reintroduced into Johannesburg National Park, and there were some family groups that were coming in, and separately there were some young males being brought in. I mean, these were young teenage males. And at the start, everything was fine, and then they started having a problem. And the problem was that these young males were chasing, almost hunting down and killing the rhino. And it just wasn't just 1 or 2 rhino. There were, I believe, over 40 rhino were actually killed. And when they brought in animal behaviorists, what they realized was happening was that these young males were coming into must at a very early age, around 18. And there was no older males to actually knock this out of them. And so they were staying in must for extensive periods of time and essentially really just going mad and exhibiting this really unnatural behavior. So what they did was they brought in some older males into the population, and then the natural hierarchy reestablished itself, and the unnatural killing of rhinos then stopped. Here's my wife, Lara, studying, she's looking at one of the family groups. And we, when we were working on the project, we knew 28 different family groups, over 1,000 different individuals. And we would follow them on a regular basis. And the family groups, the animals, they all had names starting with the same letter. So it'd be Acacia, Adina, Alexis, Adria, etc. And once you know that many animals, particularly such social animals like elephants, it becomes a real soap opera. And the thing that you notice when you study elephants, when you spend any time with elephants, is just how social they are. They're constantly communicating with each other, constantly rubbing up against each other. Infants are seldom more than 5 meters away from any other individual in the family group, just very social animals. And there are advantages to this sociality. One of them is the fact that being a family group, you have access to what we call allo mothers. These are young aunties. These are young nulliparous females, haven't given birth yet, and they will help look after their younger brothers and sisters or their cousins, etc. And what they do is that they make sure that little infant doesn't get left behind, it doesn't sort of fall asleep, and the group moves on, doesn't run into another family group. But also what these young females are doing is learning how to be a mother. So by the time that they have their first infant, then they know exactly what to do. And the other advantage of living in a family group is a defense against predation. Now, I believe that predation has probably had a major influence on elephant sociality. And if you look at places like the Congo forest, where there are no large predators, elephant family group sizes are much smaller. But there are certain parts of Africa where lions will target elephants, and particularly places like Namibia, Botswana. And what seems to happen is that you have these relatively large prize of lions, and they'll almost sort of tag team chasing down a herd of elephants until one of the elephants just gives up. And then the lions will pull them down, and they will pull down relatively large elephants, even sort of teenagers, etc., which, you know, those are pretty big. And elephants will go to great lengths to protect other family group members. And they really do display a lot of altruism. And this was brought home to me once, many years ago, when we were darting elephants from a helicopter to put some radio collars on them. And helicopters are really useful for this, because you can select the animal you want to dart, and then you can guide them away from roads or rivers, anything that might hurt them. And then normally the animals are running. And so when the darted elephant, by the time it falls asleep, the rest of the family group will be long gone. And we were doing this from a big helicopter. It's a big Bell Ranger 6-seater helicopter. And we were doing it in a swamp, which was in the center of the park. And what happened was that the darted female, before she went down, she called, and the matriarch heard her and came back. So by the time she got back to her, the darted animal was asleep. So the matriarch got down on her knees, put her tusk and trunk underneath the fallen animal, and raised her right back up onto her feet. And then the female slid back down again. And then we were worried that the sleeping animal might get hurt. So we came in fast and low with a helicopter to try and chase the matriarch away. And you know what this matriarch did? She turned around and tried to pull the helicopter out of the sky with her trunk. In fact, it took us 5 minutes to get it far enough away that we could safely get down and put the collar on. So that's the sort of level of altruism that these animals will show. I'm going to show you a series of photographs taken in Serengeti National Park in 1968 by a Swiss doctor called Horst Munzig. As far as I know, they are one of the very few photograph series showing the death of a matriarch. So the animal in question, you can see her here in the bottom left of the corner, and just prior to this photograph being taken, well, she'd been walking slowly for about a couple of days, and then just before the photo was taken, she stayed still for about 10 minutes, and now she is collapsing, and she calls her family group. And there's lots of pandemonium, panic, and gradually the matriarch dies. And lots of screaming, lots of trumpeting. The group try to lift her up, get her back on her feet. And this went on for a while. They would leave, they'd come back, they'd leave. One small elephant stayed behind, looks like a 6 or 7-year-old male, probably her latest calf. And then the rest of the family group moved up onto a ridge and spent about 2 hours feeding over there. And then they came back down following the oldest female, now the new matriarch, and they spent the rest of the day into evening with the fallen animal. And particularly when you work as a scientist in animal behavior, etc., you always thought you shouldn't anthropomorphize. But the bottom line is that elephants are highly intelligent, highly sentient, highly social animals. And it makes obvious sense to me that they would be able to respond to the death of an animal in their family group. And what's interesting about elephants is that they have specific behaviors that they exhibit around dead animals. And so, for instance, you have, if elephants, they will ignore any bones that they see in the savannah, but if they find an elephant bone, they'll stop, they'll often pick it up, they'll often put it in their mouths. And if they find a dead animal, they'll often turn around and touch it with the sole of their rear feet. Quite why, I don't know, but it's you only ever see them doing that with in the presence of dead elephants. Now, here's a nice big tusker in the Ngorongoro crater, and there aren't too many big tuskers like him anymore, mostly because they have been shot and shot for the ivory. So ivory, it's dentine, it's calcium carbonate, it's what you and I have in our teeth, but it has been the bane of elephants' existence for millennia. And there have always been waves of ivory poaching. In fact, when Livingstone first went to Africa, it's estimated that over 30,000 elephants a year were being shot to supply the ivory market, which at that time was mainly for piano keys in the burgeoning middle class in the US. And there was another big period of poaching that lasted from the 1970s until the late 1980s, when a complete trade ban on ivory was put in place. And during that period, it's estimated that perhaps almost 600,000 elephants were actually killed across Africa. And sometimes you would find, the feet that were cut off for waste paper baskets, or their tail for fly whisks, but mostly it was just a collection of bones that had had their face cut off for the ivory. But the important thing to note is that when people talk about ivory or the poaching and its impact on elephants, they tend to talk about numbers, right? So in the 1970s and 80s, Tanzania lost 55,000 elephants. Kenya lost 95% of its elephants. Uganda, 98% of its elephants. But that's only part of the story. You see, Poaching is a selective process. So if you're a poacher and you don't have too much money for bullets, you want your biggest bang for your buck, so to speak. So who do you target? Well, typically you start targeting the animals with the biggest ivory, and those are the males. So you'll shoot the males in their 60s, their 50s, their 40s, their 30s, and then you'll switch on to the females. So these are females in so the older females, and again, so the matriarchs, the older females, and not only do they have the biggest ivory, but also they form often a defensive circle around their young, and so they make easy targets. So if you have a very highly poached elephant population, what you find is that you generally have a very skewed sex structure with very few males, and a highly skewed age structure with very few old individuals. In fact, you can sometimes have virtually no individuals over the age of 20. It's almost like your classic Lord of the Flies scenario. And what had happened in Tarangire National Park was that during that period, some of the elephants that lived in the core part of the park, which is close to the park headquarters and the lodge, they suffered relatively little poaching, and they still had relatively normal age structures with some older females. Whereas other family groups that they had probably been living in the areas outside the national park, like Crosstusk, who when first knew her, she was only 15 years old, they had lost pretty much, they had been decimated by poaching. She had lost every family group member and all her bond group members. So here you had this big disparity between these elephant family groups. And in effect, the poachers had unwittingly set up a large-scale experiment in social dynamics. It allowed me to compare family groups with old matriarchs with family groups with young matriarchs to see what difference did it make to be in a group with an older or young leader. And I studied this for about 10 years. And for most of the time, there was basically very little difference at all. But there was one time when there was a big difference, and that was right at the start of the study. It was 93, and there was a severe drought, and basically there was virtually no information, virtually no vegetation left. I saw zebra and wildebeest walking around and simply dropping down dead. And many of the elephants left the national park, but not all of them. Some of them remained inside the park, and the ones that remained became highly emaciated, right? And every day they would have to make the walk from the river up one ridge, down the next valley, up to the next. And as a result, many of the infants were immediately weaned, and some of them were abandoned. And the ones that had been abandoned, the lucky ones, they would be killed by lions or hyenas overnight. The unlucky ones would die from basically heat stress. And in the last few hours, they'd often put their little trunks inside their mouths and suck up liquid and pour it over their ears. And during that period, about 40% of all the infants under 5 died of the animals that were in the park. And I thought, well, this is going to have a massive influence on this population. But what happened was that the rains came in February of 1994, and the African savannas made their usual near miraculous recovery. And the elephants that had been outside the park returned. And yes, they were skinny, they weren't in great condition, but they still had the vast majority of their infants. In fact, their infant mortality was no different to that of an average year, which meant that they'd been able to find food and, more importantly, water. So the question was why? Why did some family groups leave the park and others stay? And it wasn't just that those with young matriarchs stayed behind. Crosstusk, the 15-year-old, she left the park. And the answer didn't become obvious to me until a number of years later, when I had more information on the structure of this population. And you remember I was talking about the clans, which are groups of elephants which share the same dry season range. And what we had was 3 different clans of elephants, and 2 of those clans left and 1 stayed behind. And the difference was that the 2 clans that left had some matriarchs, some family groups led by matriarchs, which were quite old, right? In their like late 30s and early 40s. whereas the one that stayed behind only had one female over the age of 30, which was 30 to 35. So I checked the rainfall records from that ecosystem, and sure enough, the last drought of that magnitude was in 1958 to 1961. The elephants that left the park, they would have known, they would learn from following their grandmother, great-grandmothers, of where the drought refuges were, and they were now passing this information on. Whereas those that stay behind, they were too young to have done that, and as a result, they were knowledge limited. And I think what this shows is that the impact that poaching has, it can survive for many, many years after the poaching events itself, right? And it will perhaps manifest itself when the next major drought comes along. But equally, the reverse is true, that if you can retain a few older females in the population, they can greatly ameliorate the effect of poaching. And what's interesting is to note is that elephants are one of the few animals that seem to exhibit sort of post-reproductive survival, with the others being so humans and orcas. See, most animals, they die once they finish reproducing. But I think that there's very strong selection pressure for elephants to live a long time so that they can survive through these drought periods, because then these old matriarchs, these old grandmothers, they become so valuable to the survival of other members in their family group. And what we have found is that in Tarangire, since the '90s, there's been the population has grown very rapidly. At one point, it was growing at almost 7% a year, and they're also screen seems to have stopped. Sorry. At one point, we were having 5% of all infants born were twins. That was during an El Nino year. So the elephant population in Tarangire has recovered very well. Now, in 1989, a trade ban on ivory was put in place, and it was like sort of turning a tap off. Basically, poaching stopped in many East African countries and other places around Africa. And after that, elephant populations started to increase. And this map from Save the Elephants, it shows that the biggest elephant populations were in Southern Africa, Botswana, but Tanzania had over 100,000 elephants in its population. And there were also big populations in the Congo, in Gabon, etc. And the first inklings that something was wrong started coming out of the forests of the Congo in about 2006, 2007. And that was mostly in DRC. And we started hearing about elephants being shot and ivory being traded. And part of it seems to have started from the demand for coltan, which is a substance that's used in mobile phones. And people were setting up mines in DRC. And because the soil in DRC is in many areas very infertile, hunters would come in to provide bushmeat for the mines. And they would shoot the elephants, and then they started selling the ivory. And this started then permeating across the Congo Basin. This over here, this is Rod Cassidy's backyard in Central African Republic. It's called Sangabai. It's an astonishing place. If you haven't visited, you really should try and get out there. And elephants have been visiting this area probably for hundreds of years. And they will come in and they will drink from water. It's got a high mineral content, and also there's lots of social interaction over there. And this elephant population was studied by a colleague of mine at WCS, where I worked for many years, called Andrea Turkolo. And in 2013, the Seleka rebels moved in and they killed 26 elephants in the Bai itself, sometimes using her platform as a vantage point. And elephant poaching started really manifesting itself during the last part of the 2000s. So this is data from the CITES, it's the Convention on International Trade of Endangered Species. And what they have is they have a monitoring system where they have protected areas dotted all around Africa, and the rangers over there, they will record any dead elephant they find and say whether it died from natural causes or unnatural causes, i.e. whether it's poached. And they then produce what's called a pike. They do like the acronyms. That's the proportion of illegally killed elephants. And what you can see is that by 2011, the many areas across Africa, but particularly across Central Africa, were really suffering from poaching. And the paper was published showing that between 2001 and 2011, the forest elephant population declined by about 60%, and the forest elephant range declined by about 30%. But it wasn't just in the forests. It was here is the results of the Great Elephant Census carried out by the Paul Allen Foundation. And this was done in just savanna areas. And you can see Mozambique and Tanzania, in particular, populations over there suffered heavy losses. And in fact, in Tanzania, the population declined by about 60,000 elephants between 2010 and 2014. And the reason that for the ivory poaching started up again was basically because the price of ivory was going up. In 1990, 1 kilo of ivory would cost about $200 US. By 2014, a kilo of ivory in some areas would cost over $2,500. So there were big Tusker bulls out there which were worth tens of thousands of dollars for their ivory. And the reason, one of the principal reasons for this increase in the price of ivory was an increase in demand for ivory from countries in East Asia, mainly China. And the Chinese have had a long and interesting history with ivory. They've got artisans, they've traded for thousands of years. They have artisans that will make amazing sculptures like this one. But historically, the only Chinese who could have ivory were the aristocrats, the emperor, and sometimes wealthy business people. But China has changed a lot in the last 50 years. It is now an economic superpower, and there are now well over 100 million Chinese people who are middle class and now have funds to buy things like ivory. And what happened was that there was a trade ban, international trade ban on ivory put in place in 1989. However, in the 2000s, early 2000s, there were several episodes where countries from Southern Africa, they sold chunks of ivory mostly to Japan, and then in 2007, some to Japan, and also they sold 68 tons to China. And what the Chinese government did was that they stockpiled those and would release this ivory 5 tons at a time to factories dotted around the country. And these factories would then make ivory goods out of it. And what was supposed to happen was that each piece of ivory would come with a certificate showing that it came from legally obtained sources. But what was happening in effect was that some of these factories would sell on the ivory, but retain a certificate. And then they would supplement that ivory with illegally obtained ivory. And so, in effect, the domestic market was acting as a cover for the illegal trade in ivory. And in these years, in about 2011, 2012, about 70% of all the ivory was going to China. And that was at a time when China was really starting to move into Africa, and lots of trading partnerships were set up, lots of trading routes, and that, of course, helped facilitate also the movement of ivory to China. And In 2011, 38 tons of ivory were confiscated. Now, and that represents about 4,000 elephants. And if you talk to law enforcement people, they will tell you that typically only about 10% of any contraband is ever detected. So using those figures and also what was happening on the ground, scientists estimated that about 35,000 elephants a year were being killed across Africa. So clearly a massive crisis. So something had to be done. And if you want to stop ivory hunting, basically, first of all, you need to try and control the poaching on the ground. You need to try and stop the trade, the movement of the goods, and you also need to work on the demand. So many countries in East Africa started bolstering their anti-poaching efforts. And in Tanzania, this is a project that was run by WCS, helping to train elite anti-poaching units. And various projects, including ours, started using local village game scouts to act as eyes and ears in community areas to make it much harder for the poachers to move into an area. And the countries also started to tackle the trade issues. Several countries started using sniffer dogs in ports to look for ivory, and there was more training of the customs officials to try and close down the trade and those loopholes. Now, I'm no economist, but even I know that if you cut down on the supply of a commodity and do nothing to address the demand, then all that's going to happen is that the price is going to go up. And so what was important was that people in China were educated to stop buying ivory. And various different, and their surveys had been done in China, and it found that many people, if they thought at all of where ivory came from, they thought it just was collected off the ground, off dead elephants, or just fell off elephants. And very few people made that connection between them buying a piece of ivory and that piece of ivory potentially having come from a poached elephant. And so many organizations within China and as well as outside China started using the power of celebrities like Yao Ming, he's a famous basketball player, to try and get this message across. But of course, as we all know, you need political will often to make things happen, certainly in conservation. And I said that China was a major source of ivory trade, but the second biggest trade in ivory at the time was the United States. And back then, in 2014-15, you could go on eBay and buy ivory and get it shipped anywhere in the States. Now, this was coming from within the US mostly, and no one is suggesting that that internal market was being a major driver of the illegal ivory trade. But the bottom line is that if you're going to point fingers, you need to make sure that your own house is in order. And at that time, there were several reports coming out which suggested that ivory may have been a major source of funding for terrorism organizations based in Africa, such as Al-Shabaab. And so the American government was taking more and more of an interest in this. And in 2015, there was a summit between President Xi of China, President Obama, and they said that they would close their domestic markets. As I said, the international market was already closed, but they wanted to close the domestic markets. And the next year, the federal government in the US, they closed all sale of ivory across state lines, and the import of ivory as well, except in a few cases with hunting trophies. And several states also did the same thing, banned all purchase and sale of ivory products in the states. And the Chinese government agreed that they would do that. They phased it in more slowly. And in 2016, they started closing down the ivory factories. And by 2017, at the end of 2017, they had closed down all of the final ivory factories in China. And the evidence suggests that this, in combination with bolstered anti-poaching in countries like East Africa and some parts of Central Africa, and more attention to the trade, was having an impact. So the proportion of legally killed elephants in 2019, the figure for pike figure across Africa was the lowest it had been since 2003. So clearly this was having an impact, and in some aerial censuses that have been carried out in some places like in Tanzania, it shows that poaching levels have greatly reduced and elephant populations are stabilizing again. So this speaks to the power of these global treaties. We're not out of the woods. Poachers will always find the weakest link, and that at the moment appears to be Central Africa. So there is more poaching targeted at the elephant populations in Central Africa, and now it is going to different countries like Vietnam and Myanmar. And of course, you can still buy ivory online, and you can buy just about anything online, and quite how you deal with that, I certainly don't know. But the good news is that at least the poaching levels have been declining across most parts of Africa, and that gives populations of elephants in the most remotest parts of Africa a real chance of survival. So thank you very much, and I will leave it there and take any questions.
And thank you, Charles. That was a really good tour de force, covering a lot of familiar and some unfamiliar territory. So thank you for the stories and the information. I was particularly interested though in how you feel elephant society is recovering in those places where there has been heavy poaching. Obviously, it's a slow process because young elephants take decades to become old elephants. Have you had a chance to actually watch that process as it happens? And secondly, if you don't mind me just slipping in another quick one, I hope you're watching with interest the calculations by Ralph Sharmy that he concludes that each forest elephant is responsible for the additional sequestration of about, well, at current prices, $3.5 million worth of carbon, just because of the role they play in the forest. They make the forest more efficient. And do you think that is going to be the salvation, as some of us do? Check out the website rebalance.earth. But so yes, the recovery of elephant society. Have you had a chance to watch that happening? And is payment for ecosystem services attributable to elephants the future?
Well, first of all, hi Ian. I haven't seen you for years and years and years.
I'm sorry, you're just in a little box on my screen and not sharing a drink somewhere. But there you go.
Just remember you serving John Grimshaw and I mead on your front porch, what seemed like way back in the Cretaceous period or something like that. But anyway, good to see you again. Yeah, so what's interesting about what elephant populations is they do have a stunning capability to recover, right? And what we found was that in populations in Tarangire National Park, what first happens is that you get suppression. The animals are they're traumatized. They stay in these big family groups. They worry. They move at night to avoid poachers, etc. And it takes them a while to actually relax and get to the point where they can just behave like normal elephants again. And then, of course, in some areas, you might just get a suppressive effect and just not being many males around to actually breed. But quite quickly, the elephants in Tarangire started recovering from that. And then the population started increasing, and then give them enough safety and food and water, the populations can really pick up speed and really start snowballing. The problem, of course, is this thing of what happens further down the line. And if you have a big enough population, then you're always going to hopefully get some old individuals which will play a major role during periods of droughts. My concern would be in smaller populations where you may not have that. You may lose that knowledge. Populations, for instance, a place like Namibia, that could be a real issue, because if those old animals are taken out before they have shared the knowledge of where those water holes are in the desert, the rest of the elephants will never find those water holes by themselves. That's the thing. So, but most of the research that has come out really has been quite promising. Elephant populations, as I said, give them safety, they can really take off. As opposed to the other one, the question about the carbon sequestration, etc. I have not been following that, and I certainly will. And if I will actually, I will note that from the chat where it is, and start going and looking at that. And frankly, I think carbon markets may be a major source of salvation for both animal populations, but also wild areas across Africa. I know certainly in parts of Tanzania, there are some community areas now which are getting significant amounts of revenue from carbon sequestration funds. And if elephants can join in that party, so much the better.
Thank you.
Thanks, thanks, Ian. Thanks, Charles. Lorraine.
I'm happy to say that I'm going to be relocated back in Tanzania in a month. So that's very exciting. So this was perfect timing. And I love the story about how when there was a huge population of younger elephants in Must, male elephants in Must, they were doing kind of a killing spree with rhinos, which makes me kind of think, okay, so that all that argument that hunters use about, it's okay to kill the older ones or the troublesome ones is okay. So can you touch on Tanzania and hunting and conservation and that argument?
Yeah, I mean, I think what happened in that case was that you had a highly artificial society in that you had no adult elephants at all. They were all teenage elephants, right? And unless your poaching was incredibly severe, you're unlikely to end up in that sort of situation. Now, I know many people who are animal lovers, etc., they tend to dislike hunting. But many conservationists, we look at it very pragmatically, because the point is, there are large areas in Africa that are used specifically for hunting. And these are tsetse fly-ridden areas in the middle of nowhere where basically no tourist is ever going to go to just take photographs, right? And we know, we've tried it in some areas and tourists just won't go there. Whereas the hunter brings in the revenue. And what you have to understand is that if the hunters move out of an area, it's not the conservationists, who move in. Their area doesn't then get protected. It typically gets converted into agriculture, right? And when that happens, you tend to lose not just the elephants or the lions or whatever animals trying to protect, but basically everything, because then they can legitimately and legally kill the animals coming onto the farmland. And so that is the issue. Until you have a better system which will put money into the communities from non-hunting, then I see no alternative to hunting in many parts of Africa. Now, as what Ian Redmond was saying, the carbon markets, those are a really interesting one, because they potentially can produce a huge amount of money, but that market is in its infancy at the moment.
Thank you.
Thanks, Lorraine. Thanks, Charles. Chris, I'm going to ask you to unmute.
Good evening, Charles. Thank you for a really fantastic and enlightening presentation. And my question relates a little bit to the previous question. I certainly understand the need for hunting in certain circumstances where there are no other options. But having listened to your talk, what I found particularly striking, and I guess was pretty logical coming into it, was that the older elephants pass down so much knowledge to the younger ones and are vital to populations. And in keeping with that, surely the big bulls, the carriers of the biggest ivory, which are most targeted by obviously trophy hunters, are not only genetically, but also from an intellectual and a historical point of view, most important to the populations. So what would your answer be in terms of trophy hunting? Would it not be, I guess, if you are going to have trophy hunting in one form or another, be more logical to target animals of a medium or just post-medium sort of age, rather than those big animals that carry both important genetics and knowledge? Thank you.
That's a really good point. You know, I've some friends of mine say, look, these big old males, these big old tuskers, they should be looked at as Rembrandts, right? And they should be off limits. No one should be able to touch these animals. And indeed, that's happened. For instance, the elephant in Kenya, whose name escapes me at the moment, with the sort of massive tusks, and he was given sort of presidential protection, etc. No one could touch that elephant. And yeah, I think there's something to be said for that. That basically, once an animal gets above a certain age or certain tusk size, etc., then you let them be, because they will then be, the breeders, and they will ensure that you do get those genetics passed on through the population. Whether that would actually work with implementing it, I don't know. I imagine it'd be logistically complicated, but it's certainly, I think, a very good idea.
Okay, cool. Thanks, Chris, for your question. I'd just like to draw everybody's attention to the chat earlier on. Andre de George's raised some interesting points. I go back about 20 years ago. Andre was one of the lecturers when I was at Toronto University of Technology. Go and have a look at his comments there. I'm going to unmute Tessa Chamberlain.
Hi, everybody. Hi, Charles. Thanks very much for that great presentation and a lot of insights there as well. I just wanted to ask the question about the treaties, because talking about sort of sorting out the Chinese market, and now we're getting the Vietnamese, etc., coming on board with the ivory. Who would work on trying to sign up those kind of treaties with other countries that are getting involved in the ivory trade?
Sorry, I'm not sure I follow you, Tessa. Can you just repeat the question?
So, seeing as we've sorted out the Chinese trade with the ivory, who actually works on talking to other countries about doing away with the importing of ivory from poaching sources?
So,
is there a body who would go and negotiate, or is it just something that happened like with the USA, where Obama went and tied up an agreement with China? How does it work? Is there somebody who's constantly looking at those kind of issues and trying to put treaties together with other countries to avoid this kind of thing happening?
Yeah, there's a body called the IUCN, the International Union for the Conservation of Nature, which basically is mostly responsible for basically any sort of trades and treaties, etc. And it has various branches of CITES. They control the actual trade. But what you find over here is that in sort of these countries, there is no legal international trade of ivory. Okay, so any ivory that's getting to those countries is
Legal.
being imported legally. So really, it's a case of what can you do within those countries to encourage those countries to take their responsibilities to these treaties seriously. That is the thing. And, you know, it's some countries are easier, you know, than others. And quite how you go about persuading a country to do something like that, I don't know. As I said, some countries have much more lax attitudes towards enforcing wildlife treaties than others.
Okay, it's a little bit disturbing because, I mean, obviously, you know, it just puts our wildlife at huge risk, and we're just open to attacks from everywhere.
Absolutely, that's, you know, that's the issue. What happens in, you know, a country in Asia or, you know, a country in Europe, etc., can have a direct influence on what happens in South Africa or Central African Republic or whatever. That's the thing. We are all interconnected over here, and that's what makes this so tricky. Is, you know, that you need basically everyone to be on board and everyone to basically be pulling in the same direction. And the poachers will always exploit the weakest links.
Yeah, wherever the gaps come.
Mm.
Can I just also ask about that hunting? I mean, I also hate the thought of hunting, but I do understand that there are sometimes conservation issues around it. And you were talking about the big tuskers almost being treated as the Rembrandts. But for trophy hunters, those are the guys that they want to shoot because, you know, that's a bigger trophy for them and a bigger achievement and all those kind of things. Is there any control over what these hunters are allowed to go and shoot?
In the countries where elephant hunting is allowed, I have heard of there being very strict restrictions on the size, as in it can't be under a certain amount. So it, you know, it can't be too small. But I've never heard of there being a limit on how big something could be. And so yes, it's as you say, that's what the hunters will want to go for. And I don't know of any controls or restrictions on that. And it's, you know, it's something that yeah, I think that those old huge tuskers, etc., they should receive some level of protection. But again, how you actually do that, I'm not 100% sure.
So again, there's another area where, you know, there's no real protection to try and, you know, save these older elephants that are really going to pass down their knowledge.
Yeah, and it varies. Obviously, some countries they don't have hunting, so you know, in those countries it doesn't work. And most countries that hunt, they have a limitation on the number of trophies that they can actually take out. So that will also have something of an ameliorative effect. But yes, I hear you.
Okay, thanks, Charles.
Yeah.
Thanks very much, Tessa. I'm gonna I'm gonna unmute Hella Linkmeyer now. She's got a question for you, Charles.
Yeah. Yes. Hello, Charles. Thank you very much for this very informative talk about the elephants. And I find it quite amazing the success of limiting the hunting down of elephants due to this, sorry, I'm missing on the word, this treaty between America and China about this hunting down of elephants and shutting down the factories. In fact, I think this is amazing. And so I think it actually takes me to the previous speaker. What can be done about the illegal sale of ivory on the online shop? Now, the the legal sale sort of has already been addressed. Now, I think the next step, how would it be possible to deal with that? Obviously, that body, the IUCN, might be involved, or it seems to that's just that black market, where everything is possible. So that is just my question. Yeah, my hope that this will also be addressed. Thank you.
Yeah, no, I think, Hella, if any of us could come up with any way of controlling the internet and the beast that it has become, then I'd like to hear it. But it's that one's a real struggle.
Yeah, thank you. Okay. Do come.
Thanks, Hella. Leslie Cornish, I'm going to ask you to unmute. Hi, Leslie.
Hi, thank you very much. I really enjoyed that presentation. Quick question. What was the survival rate of the twins that you said were born? Because I thought normally it's not very good, but maybe with better environment, it was better. Thank you.
Good question. Oh boy, what was it? I know 7. Oh, I could probably look it up. I know that there was one female. So there was one female that had 3 consecutive sets of twins, right?
Wow.
And her sister also had another set of twins. And in that female, the one that had 3 consecutive, she lost the male in the first set of twins and the male in the third set of twins. So I think 2 out of the, how many was that? 6 of her twins died. And I cannot remember off the top of my head what the mortality rate was for some of the other ones. They do struggle a bit more just because, the demands, these are 200-pound animals, so 100 kilos and at birth. And so the milk demands are high, but it seems that males struggle a little bit more than females. They need that milk more, etc. And the females are quite clever. Young males would push away the females and they'd sort of keep them away from the mother's nipple, etc. And the females would just wait until the young male was sleeping and then go suckle as much as they wanted. So that was one. And then so there was another one. Yeah, Eleanor, that's right. So this was quite impressive. So female, she had a 8-year-old male. She had a 4-year-old male, and she had 2 3-month twins, females. And the adult female died. And the 4-year-old male moved off with other family group members. The 8-year-old male took on the twins. And basically, these twins were obviously, they still needed their mother's milk, but he taught them how to feed. He would even allo suckle. He would let them suckle, even though he obviously didn't have milk. But he would teach them how to feed and how to use their trunks and how to feed themselves and what to eat and whatnot. And he kept them alive for 8 months. And then the wet season came along and they disappeared. And I think what happened was that they probably left the national park during the wet season. And at that point, then they probably got lost and died. But, that's like an 8-year-old boy taking care of 3-month-old twins in the human society. And keeping them alive for that long. That's quite a remarkable effort.
Thanks.
Okay, thanks very much, Leslie. Abimbola Agbana has a question for you. I'm going to ask him to unmute. And he also asked a question in the chat, so I'm going to ask him to raise it now as well.
Thank you. It's still the same thing I'm trying to ask Mr. Fowler, because sometime about two years ago, in exactly 2019, around March, some elephants were spotted around Sambisa Forest. That is northeastern Nigeria. So, but we could not trace because those are the areas that are very dangerous, occupied by all these Boko Haram terrorists. So we cannot know the status now. we are not sure of the fate of those elephants. Maybe they have moved to the Cameroonian side, and I'm not. I want to know. Maybe you have that record or something. We are worried about the status and the fate.
Yeah. So I mean, well, I didn't hear about that. I know nothing about that particular elephant population or its status. And to be honest, I'm not sure who would know, because I don't know anyone. Well, as you know, those areas, it's so difficult to work in those areas. I don't know anyone who's actually working in those areas or monitoring the elephants in the areas. So unfortunately, I can't provide any further information on that. I don't know, Rod, maybe if you heard anything about that?
No, I haven't heard anything about those. I think maybe to start looking would be to ask somebody working in Cameroon, like Roger Fotso, or somebody who works in WCS in Cameroon. Maybe Paul Elkin would know. Maybe Ian Redmond would know. Ian, have you heard anything about the population of elephants in Nigeria?
No, not they were found around that border between Cameroon. It will be northwest Cameroon, because it is northeast in Nigeria. So around that border, they were spotted, and we had the report, but we could not go there to make any tracking movement because that area is occupied by these Boko Haram terrorists. So we could not go. We were bothered. The villagers confirmed it. They spoiled their farms. We had all evidence to show us that they were actually there, and pictures were taken. I will search and send.
Yeah, no,
yeah, there are still a few. There's still a few savanna elephants up in the northern part of Cameroon. I do know that, but they've been hit in the last few years. Like Bubangida had at least 500 killed about 5 years ago. No, a bit longer now actually. By Sudanese poachers coming in, and a few. So the elephants in the north have been taking a lot of strain in Cameroon, but I think there are probably still a few populations. It's a very wild area in places up there.
Yeah, very wide.
Hanging on, yeah.
Okay. I will work on the files and send it through email. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Abimbola. I saw Katerina Hecker was throwing hands up like this. I don't know if you had a question, Katerina. I'm asking you to unmute.
Thank you. Yeah, I don't know where that little green hand is to be found, but anyways, my question is around corridors between conservation areas. How successful are those, for instance, in Tanzania? Is it possible to keep those open? Do the elephants take to those once they're instituted, or do they have to be old elephant routes that are just kept open?
So it depends. It depends on the area. It depends on the level of threat to the corridor. It depends how long the corridor is. There are many factors which will influence whether these corridors are sustainable and whether the corridors are indeed being used. What's interesting about elephants is they'll sometimes go walkabout. I don't know if you heard about these elephants in China recently. They left a game reserve. It was in the south of the country, and they went on walkabout through the middle of cities, towns, everywhere. Look at it on YouTube. It's astonishing what these and the authorities were trying to keep them away from people, and they'd bait them with fruit and whatnot. And and several, a couple of elephants were born on this trip, etc. So elephants will move, and they will follow old routes that they haven't sometimes followed for years. The success on protecting it really very often depends on the local communities in the area, because most of the corridor areas are in community lands. And if the local communities feel that they're benefiting and it's in their interests, to keep these areas open, either because then they can get some sort of payments from the animals through tourism or whatever, or through other methods, then it can work. And typically, it's the shorter corridors which are much easier to protect. If you've got a relatively small corridor and that the animals use, then that's easier to find some way of trying to protect than something that is 100 kilometers long. So in answer to your question, there's a lot of work that's been done on corridors because people really recognize how important connectivity is in these areas. But it's tricky because it means that it comes down to land protection, and that can often take a lot of time.
Thank you. May I ask, Arusha National Park, do those elephants, do they still go out there? Would you know that?
Yeah, they do.
Other than into the farmlands, but have they got a real way out?
That migration corridor is highly tenuous now. There's a lot of cultivation over there. But the thing about elephants is that they are pretty much one of the last animals to stop their migration movements, because they will walk along roads at night and that sort of thing. So there is still movement between West Kilimanjaro and Arusha, but it's getting harder. It's getting harder for the animals to move. Fortunately, there are no fences, as far as I know, in that area. But as I said, there's a lot of agriculture in that area now.
I have them in my garden ever so often. I live on the border there.
Oh, whereabouts? Where do you live?
On Arusha National Park, on the close to the Ngodoto. Well, in Ngodoto village, actually.
Oh, wow. Okay. Yes. So you'll know how much cultivation there is now in those surrounding areas.
Yeah, they love coming into the fields. I was just wondering about their ability to actually move to West Kilimanjaro.
Yeah, I think it's still, elephants will still find a way, but it's getting tenuous.
Thank you.
Thanks very much, Katharina. Chris has a follow-up question.
Charles, just following on from the last question, I've been lucky enough to spend a fair amount of time with the desert-adapted elephants in Namibia, and obviously on the west side of Namibia. And I think it's common knowledge that a couple of those populations are reducing in number quite quickly. I think there are basically 3 seasonal rivers that they occur in there. And I also know, sadly, one of the big bulls was allowed to be shot. A permit was given not that long ago. I also historically have read that there used to be large numbers, up to over 1,000 animals between the southern river and the northern boundary up to the Kaneni, and a lot of those animals were obviously killed by the South African government during the Angolan War. Now, with the population decreasing so heavily, and there are very, very few big breeding age males left, would the Tosha population historically have moved into Western Namibia before the fences were put up? And based on what you've said about so much information being passed from generation to generation, in the interest of keeping the desert adapted elephants going, would there be any merit in bringing across mature bulls from Etosha, of which there's still substantial numbers there, and reintroducing them into that population because there might have been a historical connection and maybe it wouldn't be that difficult to integrate them into that society. Is there any merit in doing that, or do you think that that knowledge would have been lost over, let's say, 30 or 40 years? Thank you.
Hard to say. Hard to say whether those bulls that are now in Etosha would indeed have been moving into those areas, where they would have moved into those areas at a time when they needed to access those particular water holes, etc. I would doubt it, but that's not to say it couldn't have happened. The thing about elephants is that they can learn from other elephants, of course. So if it's simply a case of, you know, the population is declining and without having other elephants coming in, it might go locally extinct. Then you might want to make a case for introducing some individuals into that population. Although generally I dislike doing that just because of genetic reasons. Often we find later on that these animals were genetically completely distinct, and now we've sort of polluted that gene base with them. But if what you tell me was that they used to be linked, then they should be genetically indistinct. So there might be some element in that, and you could try it, because as I say, a bull, if you moved a bull elephant in, they would be able to follow either other bulls that are already in the area or possibly female groups and learn from them where they can find the water. So it's possible for that to happen. I mean, typically, because of the expense, because of the difficulties, etc., I think those should be issues of last resort. But I mean, if the population is really suffering, then yeah, I mean, it may be something that could be tried.
Great, thanks, Charles, and thank you so much for a lovely evening.
Yeah, thanks, Chris.
Thanks, Chris. And I'd just actually also like to throw in a question here for you, Charles. I mean, essentially, when we start talking about these fragmented populations of elephant, I mean, surely we should be looking at it as a meta population, and to try and sort of give Chris's question a bit of vuma is if we started looking at it from a meta population perspective, surely we'd check the genetics of those elephants to see what the connections are, and if there was actually a connection and a corridor that linked them in the past.
Yeah, I mean, quite a few genetic studies have been done now across many parts of Africa, and what they find is that, I mean, you'd be surprised. For instance, in Tanzania, I mean, the northern elephants in Tanzania are practically identical to the ones in the south, right? And they cover big areas. So if you're looking at that obviously genetic considerations are going to be important. And ultimately, these are sort of decisions that wildlife managers need to take. If a group of elephants is going to go extinct, what do you do? Do you reintroduce? Do you not reintroduce? I mean, there's so many of these decisions, and increasingly, as animal populations generally get smaller, as protected areas get smaller, etc., we're increasingly playing God, right? But the bottom line is that, if it's going to be done, it needs to follow the best, possible science, and the best measures in order to ensure that we don't mess things up because something comes up 15, 20, 50 years down the line that we never even thought of today.
Cool. Thanks, Charles. So I've got a couple of questions that were posted in the chat, and I'm going to work backwards. Human-elephant conflict is emerging as a more challenging problem for elephant conservation, probably even more important than poaching. Conservationists need to speak about this problem and make it an important global conversation. How do we reshape the conservation? HEC is a serious problem, so human-elephant conflict. And that's from Winnie Kiru.
Yeah, hi, Winnie. It's a very good point. you know, and what happens is that this is the interesting thing about elephants. There are almost always either too many elephants or too few elephants. And that sweet spot when it's just about right lasts a very short space of time. And as some elephant populations grow, then human-elephant conflict becomes a major issue. I know that some countries are trying to tackle it, certainly in Kenya, which I believe Winnie's from, with compensation, but that's really tricky because the money basically runs out and there's not enough money available. There is so much conflict going on. I think that it's the sort of thing that just has to be brought up increasingly in the press. It has to be brought up at the IUCN level, and it has to be something that NGOs start looking at more in terms of saying, okay, if you're going to look at this holistically, if you're going to protect elephants, human-elephant conflict is something that you're going to have to deal with. At some point, elephants will come in contact with humans. And so what can we do to try and stop this from taking place? Because otherwise what happens is that it's some poor farmer who has a couple of acres, he's the one who ends up bearing the brunt of successful conservation measures. So, and that isn't fair on them. So Winnie, I don't have an answer for you on that, other than, as always, it's all about communication and getting message out.
Cool, thanks, Charles. I've got another question here from Besa Koma. Thank you for the nice delivery. Please, can you share more details about the elephant social structure?
Any particular element of the social structure?
Looks like we're going to have this talk again, Charles.
Yeah, it's, I'm not sure I've got any other further details about that, but there are plenty of websites that you can go onto, and the African Elephant Specialist Group, for instance, has got sites that answer questions about general elephant social structure, and you can read about it there.
Cool. I'm not seeing any hands raised. I've got no more questions on the chat that I can see. Johan, if you can just help me and have a look to see if there's anything that I've missed. But yeah, other than that, I think there's a lot of thanks and acknowledgement for a great presentation, Charles. Yeah, and that's it. Are there any further questions from the floor?
I would just like to comment that I'd like to say thanks, Charles, for coming in. And yeah, your next talk's going to have to be on some of the nocturnal animals and using your thermoscope.
Oh yes, indeed. Yes, that's that opens up a whole new world.
Yeah. Charles has spent enough time at my place and convinced me to buy a thermoscope, and so we have one on site, and we use this for spotting nocturnal animals, and it's a real game changer in night walking. You don't disturb animals with a spotlight anymore. You find their heat signal, and then you use a red light to show your clients. It's fantastic.
Yeah, yeah, it is a game changer. Sorry, one second. And it's the fact that the animals can't see you. You're not emitting any light. You're just picking up their heat. And once you learn how to use it, these days I don't even use torch spotlights anymore. If I'm spotlighting at night, if I'm walking or even from a vehicle, I'll just use that. And it picks up animals so much more easily than a spotlight. And I can pick everything from a mouse to an elephant. And then I use the spotlight to actually clap eyes on the thing. But yeah, great things.
I had the privilege of using or being exposed to a thermoscope the other day when I was up at Punda Maria, and we were looking for some animals that had been, we were actually calling hyenas in the hope that we had called in a hyena that had been snared. The only thing we achieved was to call the elephants in, and they surrounded the vehicles where we were because they were very intrigued by what was going on here. But it was incredible to take the photograph, because the thermoscope that we were using, you could actually take photographs, and I've got these images on my phone that show the elephants as they were sort of like sniffing the vehicles to see what was going on. It was incredible.
Yeah, great little tools.
Everybody,
Yeah.
Maret has kindly made it so you can all unmute yourself if you want to have a chat with anybody or ask a question. You are free now. We are only a small amount of people left, 32 people left. So if anybody wants to greet somebody else, ask another question, please go for it.
Getting down to the die-hard, hardcore enthusiasts. Charles,
Indeed.
I just put a question in the chat box asking if you could put your favored make and model of what you're calling a thermoscope. And I had a FLIR adapter for my mobile phone, which was a very small thing that converted the mobile phone camera into a thermal camera. But is that what you're using, or are you using a bigger, fancier job?
No, we use these are sort of it looks like a monocular, a handheld monocular. You can get binoculars, but the binocular ones get expensive, and there are ones that have a screen on the back. But the problem with that is that the screen itself emits light, and animals will see the light. So I prefer to use it with the one. So it's basically a handheld. We've been using ones from a group called Pulsar, but FLIR makes them, Pulsar makes them. The models change regularly, so but typically even the cheapest model is typically good enough. You don't need something with a lot of magnification. Magnification is not the issue. It's field of vision, and the real trick is when you use these things, because the problem is that if you use them, you'll often blow out your eyeballs. So there's so much light coming through that you're then sort of half blind in the eye, and so when you get your torch or something, you can't really see it. And the real trick is to like turn the brightness down to the absolute lowest setting, and then it's just like looking at a computer screen, and then it doesn't affect your vision as much, etc. But yeah, so Pulsar and FLIR. I've never used FLIR, but I imagine it's exactly the same.